Welcome to Third Eye Weekly. Joining us today is Joanna Ebenstein, co-founder of the Morbid Anatomy Project. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we were reading up a little bit about you. In your early childhood, you had a fascination with sort of morbid, scary things.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you could start with elaborating on that.
Well, first of all, didn't you guys? Am I the
Yeah.
I think I did too. Yeah.
I
I
think
think so.
it's my belief that all children did. That's kind of one of
Mm.
my main manifestos with Morbid Anatomy. I think all kids are into that stuff, and at a certain point, especially if you're a girl, you get some very serious social messaging telling you that's not really so cool.
Mm.
I was very lucky where I had parents who were very indulgent of my hobbies and encouraged me. So I think the only thing that really makes me different from other people is I didn't have it beaten out of me in junior high and high school.
And what were some of those hobbies?
Well, when I was a kid, I collected I collected black widows and gave them to my local museum. I caught spiders and snakes and lizards and tadpoles and crayfish. I spent all my time out in nature. And then when animals would die, smaller animals like sea urchins or things that I would collect, my dad would put them in formaldehyde for me.
Cool. Very
Yeah,
cool.
so I had
you
the
had your own museum almost.
yeah, that's really what I always wanted was my own natural history museum, and that's not far from what ended up happening. It turned out. And so when I was a little kid, I wanted to be like a veterinarian or a wildlife photographer. So it just so happened that I ended up photographing dead instead of live animals. Really, not that far from my original aim.
Yeah. And speaking of death, this might be a bit of a stretch, but do you remember when you first learned about the concept of death and maybe what your reaction was like to it? I know it's
a really good question. I don't. No one's ever asked me that, but that's a great question. One thing I can say is one of the books that was really popular in my household growing up that my mom read me when we were really little was Charlotte's Web, which is really a meditation on death. And it was our favorite book. It was the movie we'd watch every Thanksgiving, every autumn, which is kind of that time of death. So that's probably the first thing I remember. I don't remember being traumatized or shocked. I just remember loving that book so much.
Yeah.
And then when I was little, I also loved all of those books. I'm a little older than you guys, so I don't know if you know these books, but like A Taste of Blackberries or Bridge to Terabithia, all these kind of young adult novels where a character dies. And I don't know why that was so attractive to me. I think now that I look at it, it's just an intense emotion. And I think certain kids, certain people maybe are attracted to intense emotion, and happiness only gets you so far. There's something about that poignance, especially experienced through art or literature, that's really, really meaningful, I think.
Yeah, I think we all kind of want to have that deeper feeling on life. There's like different levels of life, and like death does bring about those deeper
I think
feelings.
that's right. And I think some people don't like those feelings. And that's why I think a lot of people in our society kind of shy away from that discussion. I think part of it is a discomfort with really feeling on a deep level, or having to have an immediate real encounter with another person that's kind of not bullshit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like not small talk. Like it really cuts. Like ever since we opened up the museum, and I will sit in the museum sometimes and just talk to people who come in, especially at the beginning. A lot of people want to talk about this stuff right off the bat. They don't want to talk about the weather or what they like to eat. They just want to talk about their own experiences with death, and suddenly you feel like you know that person in a really deep way in minutes. And I just think that's really interesting. I think some people find that very off-putting, and then other people, maybe these are the people who are attracted to the museum, people like me, really thrive on it and really feel alive when they're experiencing those kinds of conversations.
Do you think it's like it stems from more of a personal fear of encountering those emotions and feelings, or do you think it's more of a societal fear to not really delve into those questions?
I think it's societal, and I'll say that because I've traveled a lot. We did 2 trips to Mexico for Day of the Dead, and I feel it's very American. It's very Western in general, but I feel like I've thought a lot about why. I've given certain lectures, I've given them here, and I've given them in England, and there's a different reception in both places. In England, it's not the same as here, and I think part of the reason is America's such a young country, and we just don't have that kind of mass of history and death. Like in England, in London, every time they dig to extend the tube, they find skeletons every time because there's been civilization there since the Roman times. So there's not even a possibility of really denying death there. We're here, I think, because we're a new nation, because very few wars were fought on our soil. We had 9/11, we had the Civil War, and that's about it. Everything else was overseas. We don't have that direct relationship. We haven't had to confront it in the same way. And I think a lot of people came here after World War II in particular, trying to find a new utopia where death and destruction didn't exist, and this is like where the happy ending in films comes from and all of this. So I think it's really complex, but I think mostly it's because we're adolescence as a country where everyone else is already like an old person. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Our culture hasn't experienced an actual massive death.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And just
that's
as far as
interesting.
age, we're closer to a child or an adolescent than to, Europe has gone through so much. I lived in Hungary for 6 months, and it's just like the Nazis, the communists, like history just happened to them, and people's lives were devastated, and that's really rare in the United States. I feel like in the same way, or at least on that level.
Definitely.
Well, to bring it back to the museum here in Brooklyn, you guys established it in a library, correct? Right?
Well, it started as a library. It's complicated. So the whole project started as a blog, and
Mhm.
then then I started to on my blog I had a bibliography of the books I was using for my research, and people began to email me and ask if they could use these books.
Mm.
So I moved all those books to a really small space, about a little bit bigger than this, which is why I like cozy. 300 square foot space, no windows, and I made it open by appointment. And then that became kind of too much for me to handle, so it began to be open one day a week, and I started to get docents. Then we started to do lectures, and it kind of was just going like that. Then we started to do taxidermy classes, which is a whole other story. And then this woman, Tracy Hurley Martin, came into the space and really fell in love with it and said, I think this should be something bigger. And so we decided to collaborate on this new place, which is a museum, which is much larger. It's like 4,200 square feet. It's in a former nightclub. And
Nice.
it's a really, really great space.
Awesome.
Did you ever think that you would have the kind of community that you have now when you started it?
No, to be honest, when I started the blog, I did not intend it for an audience at all. It was really, I just taken on this art project. It was a photo exhibition about medical museums. So I traveled around Europe and I collected like thousands of photographs, and then also all of these links that I was using again and again, these books. And so I started to use the blog really as just a way to sort through my material and start to organize and think, well, I have all this stuff. Now, what do I want to say with it? And I didn't really understand how blogs work, honestly. Like, I was not a reader of them, I was not a consumer, but almost immediately it developed a following, and people started to email me and say, I didn't know there was anyone else like this in the world. This is the beauty of the internet,
Yeah.
right? Is it there are so many people like that, it turns out, but there was nowhere for them all to meet. But I never meant that to be. I'm delighted that it happened, but it was never my intent. And now that's probably the most important part about it as far as I'm concerned. You probably already know, in addition to the museum, we do events like 3 or 4 times a week. We have classes almost every weekend. We do flea markets, we do singles nights, we do parties, and we have a really, really strong, active, engaged, and lovely community that comes to these things. And that is like the best part of the whole thing.
It's fantastic.
It really is. Have you guys been?
Haven't
I
been
actually
yet.
have
Guys,
not
We need
been.
to
Yeah,
go.
we
Yeah,
need
well,
to go.
anytime, just let me
Absolutely.
know. I'd be very happy to show you around. It's a really lovely thing.
Yeah,
Awesome.
definitely. You guys have some new upcoming exhibits, right, going on?
We do. Our exhibit up right now is called Opus Hypnagogia. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So this is curated by a guy named Stephen Romano, who has a gallery used to have a gallery in Dumbo, and now it's in Bushwick. And he's kind of a curator of outsider and contemporary art. But what he did in our exhibition, he responded to the space. So it's a mix of books from the 16th century and like church art from the 19th century and contemporary art, and all of these things are revolving around this idea of hypnagogia, which is the space between being asleep and being awake.
Mhm.
So it's kind of that kind of lucid dreaming mentality expressed through visionary art. And it's a great show. It's really fabulous. And then we have the permanent collection as well, and we have a new show opening on October 23rd, which will be called House of Wax.
Mhm.
And that's going to be never before seen in the United States wax models from Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century. And they're
Wow.
out of control. I'm actually working the text for it now.
Yeah, they're called what was it called? Ponocopia or
Panopticon.
Panopticon?
Yes.
Panopticon. Yeah. And so what exactly is that? Because I found that so fascinating.
Yeah, I'm still learning about it. It's mostly a European phenomenon, which is part of why it's hard to parse. It happened a lot in Sweden and in it looks like the Netherlands. I'm trying to think of the catalogs I've seen. Germany, a lot in Germany, and so this collection's from Germany, and it's kind of like, have you heard of dime museums here in the United States, or like Barnum's Museum? So in the 19th century, Barnum, who went on to be like
P.T. Barnum, right?
yeah, exactly. So the guy who went on to create the circuses and all these things that we remember him for. He had a museum that was here in New York. I think it was on Broadway, and it was a one-stop place to see everything fascinating in the world. So it's kind of somewhere between a cabinet of curiosity and today's museum. So it had wax models of famous people. It had Indian handicrafts. It had taxidermy. It had an aquarium. It had live freaks exhibiting themselves. It had a lecture hall. All of these things under one roof, and that's kind of what panopticons were like.
Okay.
So the more I read about them, the more I thought they were just kind of wax collections, but that's not it at all. Like this one in particular, Castens said it had elephant tusks, mummies, wax models of diseased genitalia, and full length figures called anatomical Venuses, which is a large part of what we talk about at Morbid Anatomy. So they're wax women, life size, reclining with their stomachs opened up, showing
Wow.
the mysteries of generation. So we'll have two of those there,
Huh.
and also ethnographic waxes, which is there's a couple things that will be troubling to audiences, but I what we're trying to do at Morbid Anatomy is show these things that nobody else wants to talk about or show from the past. And I think it's something very important to talk about. And this was also, of course, something happening here in Coney Island. And we had,
Yeah.
human zoos. We had Bontoc tribesmen on display at Coney Island. You could take the train out there in the turn of the century and see them in their native habitat recreated.
It's crazy.
It is, and I feel like again, it's just so underknown. Nobody talks about this stuff. And I was actually the artist in resident at Coney Island residents at Coney Island a few years ago, and that's when I started doing my research about. It's like, what were the things that were going on? And I actually really felt cheated. There's so much really strange and fascinating stuff that was going on that nobody in New York ever talks about. And I think it's because we don't want to, because it's kind of an unpleasant. It reminds us of how base we are and how little we've changed, frankly. I think we still are fascinated by looking at such things, and now it's just done on television. What I would argue.
Yeah, not something you're going to find in history books teaching kids.
No, no, but not even in like our history. People our age who are excited about kind of weird, offbeat things. It's just not really out there.
Yeah,
it's so surprising to me, and that's one of the reasons that the Morbid Anatomy Library exists too. So this collection that I have of books and artifacts, we have books on human zoos, we have books on these things, and people will come in, and our docents are knowledgeable, and if they hear, oh, I'm doing research on the Hottentot Venus. Oh, well, did you know about humans? Oh, no. And there's all these materials that we have related to that stuff in the library.
Excellent.
Wow.
So, how about one of your favorite exhibits you've had in the past?
My favorite exhibit so far was probably our very first one, which was called The Art of Mourning. And it was very close to me because it's based on a project that I've been thinking about since long before Morbid Anatomy. When I was 16, I went to Europe for the first time and started to go to churches and look at these kind of fine art representations of death. And this is a lot of what led to Morbid Anatomy for me. I went to Germany in particular, and I was just really surprised that there were all of these representations of death where death was beautiful. And I grew up in California, where the only above board, I wouldn't say above board, the only real representations of death that I saw in my childhood were, horror movies and goth and heavy metal art, and which just makes it kind of tawdry and ugly. And I went to these churches and these museums, and you see these martyrdoms, you see these amazing reliefs of skulls with bat wings and jeweled skeletons and things like that. And it just completely blew my mind. And from then on, I began to collect, and this is before the internet really, images of death and its representation in different cultures. So the Art of Mourning was very much an extension of that. I feel like I had already written the text in my head when I was 16, essentially. So all I did is I went to a lot of friends of mine who are collectors, who are local, who have amazing things, and they very, very generously loan their things. So we had post-mortem photographs, we had hair art jewelry. I don't know if you know about this. So hair art in the 19th and 18th century, it was pretty popular to make jewelry or shadow boxes using hair of the beloved, sometimes the deceased beloved, or sometimes just someone who was separated by time or space. It was kind of a sentimental art. And we had these incredible pieces woven from human hair, including one that was like a diorama under a bell jar where you have like a wax monument, like cemetery monument. All the trees are made of the hair of the family. So things like that. These things that I think exist at museums still, but nobody quite knows what to do with them anymore. Like in the 19th century, they were very important. They were seen as memory and probably as art. But now I feel like no one quite knows what to do with them. I don't even know what to call it. Is it art? Is it folk art? Is it just artifacts of memory? But because no one quite knows how to catalog things anymore, categorize things in our contemporary museums, I feel like all of these things just get lost. And that's going back to the Panopticon. What's so intoxicating about that to me is this idea of this mesh of disciplines. It is art and it's science and it's wax and it's amusement and it's performance and all of those things. And nobody felt the need to kind of divide it up into little separate places. And that doesn't really happen, I think, until like the 1860s and 1870s in museums like the Met and the Natural History Museum. And I think I'm really intrigued by the history museums where you're not forced to separate everything out in that way, that kind of makes it dead and unrelated for me personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything's put together in a category, never
Yeah.
really seen all together.
Yeah, and I think something's lost when that
Yeah.
happens, and I think if you really want to understand the past, which is something that I do want to do, it's by looking at that combination of things and how they interrelate. That's what I think.
Well, great. Well, very important discussion to have. Thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
being here. Those are all
Thanks
the
for having
questions we
me.
have.
That's great.